My name is Diane Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who has spent most of her life pouring love into her only son and his family. I never thought I would be standing in the middle of a crowded restaurant holding a glass of water in one trembling hand while my daughter-in-law smiled at me in a way that cut far deeper than words. But that night I learned exactly where I stood in her eyes, and I made a decision I had never imagined making. It was Oliver's 7th birthday. The whole family was there along with a dozen friends and relatives from Sophie's side. The air smelled of roasted chicken and warm bread. Balloons floated lazily above the tables. I had been looking forward to this night for weeks, not only because I adore my grandson, but because I thought this gathering might finally thaw the chill that had been creeping between me and Sophie for years. Halfway through the evening, Sophie stood up, glass of wine in hand. Her long hair fell perfectly over one shoulder, her smile bright enough to catch everyone's attention. She tapped her glass gently for silence. "I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight." She began glancing around the table. Then her eyes landed on me. And of course, a special thanks to Diane. She is just adorable, always trying her very best. Her voice lingered on those last words. The corners of her mouth lifted in what to anyone else might have looked like a kind smile, but to me, and perhaps to a few who knew better, it carried the sharp edge of condescension. A few guests chuckled politely. My cheeks flushed hot. I took a slow sip of water to steady myself. In that moment, I could feel every pair of eyes on me, some curious, some pitying, others pretending they hadn't noticed the sting behind Sophie's compliment. It might have ended there, just a small humiliation I could have tucked away. But she tilted her head toward me again, holding my gaze a second too long. "She's always trying, aren't you, Diane?" she said softly, almost sweetly, yet loud enough for the table to hear. I smiled. What else was I supposed to do? I have learned that sometimes silence speaks louder than any retort. Without a word, I reached into my purse, pulled out my wallet, and handed my credit card to the waiter who had just arrived with the bill. "I'll take care of it," I said calmly. No drama, no raised voice, just the gentle firmness of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. There was a brief murmur around the table. Sophie's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she masked it with another smile. She said nothing. Neither did I. I signed the check, slipped the receipt back to the waiter, and stood. "Thank you all for a lovely evening," I said, my voice steady. I leaned down to kiss Oliver on the top of his head, inhaling the familiar scent of his shampoo. Then I walked out, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor, each step echoing in my ears. But what no one at that table knew, not Ethan, not Sophie, not even Oliver, was that my decision that night went far beyond paying for one dinner. I had been quietly funding much of Sophie's lifestyle for years. The spa treatments, the designer handbags, the gourmet dining, all of it charged to a credit card in my name, a card she had grown to treat like her own. I had allowed it, telling myself it was for the sake of keeping peace in the family, for the sake of Oliver. That night changed everything. As I walked to my car under the warm glow of the street lamps, I felt a strange calm settle over me. My heart no longer pounded from embarrassment. Instead, it beat with the certainty of a woman who has finally drawn her line in the sand. She had shamed me in front of everyone, and I had paid the bill with a smile. But before the night was over, I would quietly pull the plug on the life of luxury she thought would last forever. She would never see the silence coming, and when it did, she would finally learn that generosity should never be mistaken for weakness. I did not yet know how deep the consequences would run. I did not yet know the secrets hiding behind Sophie's polished smile or the ways my decision would ripple through our family. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The woman who walked out of that restaurant was not the same one who had walked in. I was done being the silent benefactor. I was done being the polite target of thinly veiled jabs, and I was ready, truly ready, to take back my dignity, my boundaries, and my peace. The restaurant smelled of frosting and warm bread when I arrived that evening, holding the cake I had spent 3 days planning and decorating. It was for Oliver, my 7-year-old grandson who loves the stars, the planets, and anything to do with space. He'd been talking about his birthday for weeks, calling me almost every other day to share his latest discoveries about Jupiter's moons or the phases of the moon. I had promised him a cake that was as magical as the galaxy he loved so much. Layers of moist chocolate, frosted in midnight blue, with delicate sugar planets orbiting a shimmering silver sun in the center. It was my way of telling him without words how much he means to me. As I walked toward the table, Oliver's eyes lit up. "Grandma, is that my galaxy cake?" His voice carried the pure, unfiltered excitement only a child can have. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, lowering it so he could see the details. "And every planet is edible, even Saturn's rings." He grinned so wide I could see the gap where his front tooth had been. For that brief moment, it was just the two of us in the universe. But then Sophie's voice cut in from the other end of the table. "Oh, how sweet," she said, smiling for the benefit of the guests around her. "That's very homemade." Her tone was light, but I felt the jab underneath. A few guests chuckled politely, not quite sure whether they were supposed to. My cheeks warmed. I tried to focus on Oliver, who was still staring at the cake with wide-eyed wonder. Before I could set it on the table, a waiter appeared carrying a tall, pristine cake in white fondant and gold accents, the kind you see in bridal magazines. Sophie's smile widened as she gestured toward it. "Here's the cake for the party," she announced brightly. "I thought it would be nice to have something professional." Oliver's face fell just slightly. He looked from the galaxy cake in my hands to the gleaming tower of sugar the waiter had placed in the center of the table. "But Mom," he said quietly, "I wanted Grandma's cake for my candles." Sophie leaned down toward him, still smiling for the guests. "We'll have Grandma's cake later, honey. This one is for the pictures." There it was again, that subtle public brush-off. My cake, the one Oliver had been dreaming about, was gently but firmly removed from the spotlight. I set it down at the far end of the table, telling myself not to make a scene. We sang Happy Birthday around the white and gold cake. Oliver dutifully blew out the candles, but his eyes wandered toward the other end of the table where my galaxy cake sat untouched. I caught his gaze and gave him a small smile. I wanted to tell him it was all right, but the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. After the candles were blown out, slices of the fancy cake were passed around. No one mentioned mine. I poured myself a small glass of water and sipped slowly, watching Oliver poke half-heartedly at his piece. A few minutes later, he slipped away from his chair and came to stand beside me. "Grandma," he whispered, "can I have your cake now?" I glanced toward Sophie, who was laughing with a friend at the far end of the table, oblivious. I nodded. "Of course you can, sweetheart." We cut a slice together, and he took the first bite with a smile that melted my heart. "This is the best cake ever," he said, around a mouthful of chocolate. In that moment, the noise of the restaurant faded. It didn't matter that my cake had been sidelined. What mattered was that Oliver knew it was made for him with love. Still, the sting of being publicly diminished lingered. When I returned to my seat, Sophie glanced at the empty plate in Oliver's hands. "Oh, you're having some of that," she said, her voice just a shade too light. "Yes," I replied, simply keeping my tone even. The evening went on, laughter, clinking glasses, polite conversation. But I couldn't shake the image of my cake sitting in the shadows while the spotlight shone on the one Sophie had chosen. It wasn't just about dessert. It was about the quiet ways people can tell you you're not enough even when you've given your very best. As I helped Oliver gather his new toys at the end of the night, he hugged me tightly. "Thank you for my galaxy cake, Grandma. I'm going to remember it forever." I smiled and kissed the top of his head. "Baba always keeps her promises," I said softly. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't just a passing moment. It was another small crack in the bridge between Sophie and me, and sooner or later, that bridge was going to break. A few days after Oliver's birthday party, I was sitting at my kitchen table finishing my morning coffee when I heard the familiar sound of Ethan's car pulling into my driveway. I wasn't expecting him. He walked in carrying that easy smile he's had since he was a boy, though I noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning, Mom," he said, dropping his keys into the little ceramic bowl by the door, the same one he'd made for me in middle school art class. He poured himself some coffee without asking, just like he always had. We sat down together, and for a few minutes we talked about Oliver, how he'd been staying up late, reading about constellations, how his school project on the planets had earned him a gold star. It was easy familiar. It almost felt like old times. Then Ethan leaned back in his chair and took a slow sip from his mug. "Mom," he began, "there's something Sophie and I wanted to ask you." I set my cup down, sensing a shift. "All right," I said carefully. "It's about Oliver." He continued, keeping his tone warm. "You know how quickly he's growing, and there are so many things we want to do for him. Activities, classes, things that will give him a head start. Sophie was thinking it might make things easier if she had access to a credit card from you, just for things Oliver might need." I nodded slowly, letting his words sink in. "A credit card," I repeated. "Yeah," Ethan said, leaning forward, his hands clasped together. "That way she can pick things up without having to run it by you every time. You know, Sophie, she likes to be prepared." He gave me a boyish grin, the one that had gotten him out of trouble more times than I could count when he was growing up. My mind went back 20 years to a cramped apartment in upstate New York, where a much younger Ethan sat at my kitchen table surrounded by textbooks. I had worked double shifts at the school and tutored on weekends just to keep him in college. I remembered the way he'd looked at me back then, grateful, determined, trusting. "You've always done so much for me, Mom," he said, almost reading my thoughts. "And I know this is asking a lot, but it's really for Oliver." Something in my heart softened. This was my son, after all, my only child. And if he believed this would help Oliver, who was I to say no? "All right," I said, after a pause. "I'll add Sophie to my account, but only for Oliver's needs. I trust you'll make sure of that." Ethan smiled in relief. "Of course. You know Sophie loves Oliver more than anything. She just wants what's best for him." I wanted to believe that. In that moment, I did believe it. I told myself that this was simply another way of loving my grandson, giving his parents the freedom to provide for him without worry. We spent the rest of the morning talking about lighter things. He told me about a case he was working on, and I shared a few recipes I'd been experimenting with. When he left, he kissed my cheek and thanked me again. After he was gone, I sat for a while in the quiet kitchen, my fingers tracing the rim of my coffee mug. I thought about how all his life I had stepped in when Ethan needed help. I had been the safety net, the person who would always catch him. I didn't see this as any different. In my mind, this was simply another chapter in that story, a continuation of the same trust we had built over decades. If there were warning signs, I didn't notice them. If there were reasons to hesitate, I brushed them aside. I told myself I was helping my son and by extension, my grandson. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. What I didn't realize, what I couldn't realize, was how quickly that trust could be stretched and how easily it could be broken. It started quietly, almost innocently, with the first monthly statement. I opened the envelope on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the same kitchen table where Ethan had asked me for the favor. I expected to see a few small purchases, maybe school supplies, clothes for Oliver, or an occasional grocery trip. Instead, the first charge caught my eye immediately. Serenity Day Spa, $240. I frowned, flipping the page. A few lines down, Maison de Luxe, handbags, Ward 850s. Then a dinner at La Belle Époque, a French restaurant so expensive you have to book a table weeks in advance. That bill alone was nearly $600. I stared at the list, reading it twice, as if the numbers might change the second time around. But they didn't. There was nothing that even hinted at Oliver's needs. No books, no science kits, no payments for after-school classes. Just indulgences. Turning to the next page, I noticed something stranger. Investment Group, LLC, $3,000. It wasn't a store, not even a membership I recognized. I tapped my finger against the paper, trying to recall if Ethan had mentioned Sophie investing in something. He hadn't. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. But the truth was already pressing against my chest. This wasn't what we had agreed upon. 2 days later, Oliver called me on FaceTime. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor of his room, a stack of picture books beside him. His hair was sticking up in 3 different directions, and he was grinning from ear to ear. "Hi, Grandma," he said, adjusting the camera so I could see the solar system mobile hanging from his ceiling. "I've been reading about Saturn's rings. Did you know they're made of ice and rock?" We chatted for a while, and I asked him if he'd gotten any new toys or books lately. He shrugged. "No, Mom says I have enough already. She said I don't need more stuff right now." Something in me sank. It wasn't the fact that he didn't get new toys. He had plenty, I knew that. But the way it connected to the spending I'd just seen. The card was being used freely, but not for him. "Do you have everything you need for school?" I asked, gently. "Yeah," he said, flipping through one of his books. "But I wanted a telescope for my birthday." Mom said maybe later. I smiled, but inside the weight in my chest grew heavier. I had given them the means to provide for him, and yet here he was wishing for something simple, a tool to feed his curiosity, and being told maybe later. After we hung up, I went back to the statement, laying it flat on the table. I traced each charge with my finger line by line as if I were grading a paper in my old classroom. Every charge painted a picture I didn't want to see. Spa days, luxury handbags, gourmet dinners. Thousands poured into something labeled Investment Group. And not one sign of Oliver in the mix. I thought about the promise I had made to myself when I agreed to this arrangement, that this was for Oliver, and for Oliver alone. That belief had been my comfort, the reason I hadn't hesitated when Ethan asked, but now it felt like I'd been naive. My mind went back to that night in the restaurant. Sophie's glass raised high, her voice lilting with condescension. I remembered the way she had looked at me, not as a partner in Oliver's life, but as an accessory. And now looking at these statements, I saw the truth in that look. I wasn't just an accessory in her eyes, I was a resource to be tapped. For a brief moment, I considered calling Ethan right away, confronting him with the list. But I stopped myself. This was still early. Maybe there was an explanation, maybe Sophie had plans for these investments that would eventually benefit Oliver. I wanted to give her the chance to prove me wrong. Still, a quiet voice inside me whispered otherwise. And that voice was growing louder. I folded the statement carefully and slid it into a drawer. The weight of it seemed to linger in the room like a secret I hadn't yet decided how to handle. But deep down, I knew this was not going to end the way I had hoped. This was the second crack in the bridge between us, and bridges don't break all at once. They give warnings, small, sharp sounds that tell you the fall is coming. 2 days later, I met Laura at our favorite little coffee shop downtown. We'd been coming here together for more than 20 years, long enough for the barista to know our orders by heart. She slid my cappuccino across the counter with a smile and handed Laura her chai latte. We settled into our usual corner booth by the window, the one with the worn-in cushions and the view of the park across the street. Laura pulled her scarf a little tighter around her neck and gave me that look she's given me since we were both young teachers, half concern, half tell me everything. "You've been quiet," she said gently, stirring her latte. "Something's on your mind." I hesitated. I hadn't planned to tell her everything, but Laura has a way of making me feel safe. So I told her about Ethan's visit, about the credit card arrangement, about the spa charges, and the handbags. And finally, I told her about Oliver's quiet admission that his mom had said he didn't need anything new. Laura listened without interrupting, her eyes steady on mine. When I finished, she took a slow sip of her latte before speaking. Diane. She began softly, "You know I care about you, so I'm going to say this the way I would want someone to say it to me. Be careful. I've been where you are." I raised an eyebrow. "You have?" She nodded. "A few years ago, my daughter married a man who, well, he had a way of making everything sound like it was for the good of the family. When they hit a rough patch, I helped them out. First it was groceries, then rent, then a little extra for their future plans." She sighed. "Before I knew it, I was covering half their life. And when I stopped, the visits slowed, the calls got shorter. It was like I'd lost my daughter overnight." Her words sat heavy between us. I thought about the times Sophie's friendliness seemed selective, about how much of my role lately felt tied to what I could provide rather than who I was in Oliver's life. "I'm not saying that's what will happen here," Laura added quickly, her tone warm, "but I am saying that once you start giving at this level, it's hard to step back without consequences." I traced the rim of my coffee cup. "But it's for Oliver," I murmured. "That's what makes it worth it." Laura's expression softened even more. "I know, honey, and you're a good grandmother. But tell me how much of that statement you saw was actually for Oliver." Honestly, the answer came too quickly in my head. None. Not the spa days, not the handbags, not the fine dining, and certainly not the mysterious investment charges. I guess. Not much, I admitted quietly. Laura reached across the table and gave my hand a squeeze. "Then you need to start thinking about boundaries. Not as walls to keep people out, but as lines that protect the people and the love you care about most. If this goes on, you risk not just your savings, but your place in Oliver's life, because money changes the way people relate to each other, even when we don't want it to." Her voice was calm, almost tender, but every word landed with weight. I thought about Oliver, about the telescope he'd wanted, about the look in his eyes when he saw my galaxy cake pushed aside. "I don't want to lose him," I said barely above a whisper. Laura gave me a knowing smile. "Then don't let yourself get lost in trying to keep the peace. Peace bought at the expense of your own respect never lasts." Outside the window, a gust of wind blew through the park, scattering a swirl of red and gold leaves. For a moment, I wished I could freeze time right there. Warm coffee, a safe friend, a problem I could keep in this booth and not take home with me. But life doesn't work that way. When we finally stood to leave, Laura pulled me into a hug. "Just promise me you'll think about what I said," she murmured. "I will, I promised." And I meant it. At least I thought I did. But as I walked to my car, I told myself there was still room for trust, that maybe Sophie just needed time, that this was still somehow about Oliver. What I didn't know was that I was already standing on the edge of the next crack in that fragile bridge. The following weekend, I was pruning the hydrangeas in my front yard when I saw Michael Grant walking his dog down the street. Michael and I had been neighbors for nearly 30 years. A retired surgeon with a mind as sharp as ever, he had known my late husband and often checked in on me since I began living alone. He stopped at my gate, resting a hand on the latch. "Diane," he called with a warm smile, "you've been scarce lately. Everything all right?" I wiped my hands on my gardening gloves. "Keeping busy," I replied, trying to stay out of trouble. Michael chuckled. "That's not like you. Want some company? Bella could use a rest." He motioned toward his golden retriever, who promptly flopped down on my walkway. We settled onto the front porch. I poured us each a glass of iced tea, the condensation running down the sides. We spoke of small things. First, the weather, the changes in the neighborhood, but I could feel his eyes studying me with quiet concern. Finally, he said I saw Sophie the other day at the country club. She was talking to a group of people I know from the investment circle. I raised an eyebrow. "Investment circle?" "Yes," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They meet twice a month, mostly to pool money for high-risk ventures. Not exactly the kind of thing you join casually." Sophie seemed, well, very confident. She was telling them she had access to a stable source of funds from her family. The words landed in my chest like a stone. I thought about the mysterious investment group charge on my last statement. I tried to keep my expression neutral. Did she mention what the investments were? For Michael shook his head. No, just that she was positioned to contribute regularly. People seemed impressed. She even hinted that she didn't need to worry about liquidating personal assets because she had, let's say, outside support. I felt a cold thread work its way down my spine. Outside support. That could only mean me. She had not only been using my card for these investments, but apparently speaking of it as her own secure backing. Michael glanced at me carefully. I hope you don't mind me saying this, Diane, but it sounded like she was counting on you in a way that didn't sound temporary. I forced a small smile. I appreciate you telling me. Really. We sat in silence for a moment, the clink of ice in our glasses filling the gap. Bella stretched out at Michael's feet, letting out a sigh. Michael cleared his throat. Just be sure you know where your generosity is going. Sometimes people think they're helping family, but they end up financing dreams that aren't theirs to carry. His words echoed Laura's, but they hit differently, coming from him, measured factual with the quiet weight of someone who had seen this story unfold before. I'll keep that in mind, I said softly. After he left, I sat on the porch long after the sun had dipped behind the trees. My mind kept returning to his description of Sophie's confidence, the way she had spoken to that group. It was as though she had already built a future on the assumption that my resources would always be hers to draw from. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was not one I liked. Spa days and handbags were one thing. This was another entirely. Investments carried risk, and if she was using my credit to take those risks, then I was shouldering a burden I had never agreed to bear. That evening, I took the credit card statement out of the drawer where I had tucked it away. I stared at the line that read, Investment Group LLC, $3,000, and traced it with my fingertip. In my mind, it now had a face. Sophie at a polished table, laughing easily, speaking as though she had her own private bank in her back pocket. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly. Whatever this was, it was no longer about helping Oliver. This was about something else, something Sophie was building for herself. And for the first time, I found myself wondering just how far she'd be willing to go to keep me tied to it. The thought came unbidden. If I stopped the flow of money, would she try to cut me off from Oliver? And in that moment, I realized she might already be planning exactly that. It was a cold Tuesday afternoon when Sophie arrived unannounced. I saw her sleek black SUV pull into my driveway, its engine idling for a moment before shutting off. When I opened the door, she stood there with a polished smile, wearing a cream wool coat that looked like it had stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. "Hi, Diane," she said lightly, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite her. "Do you have a moment?" Her tone was pleasant enough, but something in her eyes told me this wasn't a casual visit. She made her way to the living room, choosing the armchair by the window. I followed, feeling the kind of heaviness you get when you know a conversation is about to change things. "I wanted to talk to you about the credit card," she began, crossing one leg over the other. "It's not really working the way we thought it would." I sat back in my chair, keeping my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" She smoothed an invisible crease on her coat sleeve. "Having you see every purchase isn't very efficient. It creates unnecessary questions, and honestly, it's not the best use of your time." I waited, sensing there was more. "I think it would be better if you just gave us a set amount every month," she continued, her voice measured and calm. $10,000 should be enough. That way you don't have to look at individual charges or wonder what's for Oliver and what's not. The number landed between us like a dropped weight. 10,000, I repeated, as if the sound of it might help me process it. Sophie tilted her head slightly as though explaining something to a student. "Yes, that would cover everything: Oliver's activities, school supplies, family needs, and it would make life easier for everyone." Her delivery was smooth, but my mind flashed back to the charges. I'd seen the spa days, the handbags, the lavish dinners, the mysterious investment group. None of it had been for Oliver, not once. That's A lot of money, I said finally. She gave a soft, almost sympathetic laugh. Diane, you've always wanted the best for your grandson. You've said so yourself. This would make sure he never goes without. And it keeps you from being bogged down in receipts and statements. I didn't respond right away. The air between us seemed to thicken, and for a moment her gaze locked onto mine. The softness in her eyes cooled. If this isn't something you're comfortable with, she said slowly, then we might have to make some adjustments in other areas. I narrowed my eyes slightly. Adjustments. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on her knees. If things become too complicated, we may have to limit how often you see Oliver. I'm sure you understand. Children need stability, and any tension between adults isn't good for him. The words were spoken quietly, but they struck me harder than if she had shouted them. There it was, not even disguised as suggestion. My access to my grandson, the time I treasured most, was now something she was willing to place on the bargaining table. I felt the floor shift beneath me. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, each second stretching longer than the last, but I kept my voice calm, almost level. That sounds like a condition. She smiled faintly, straightening her posture again. Of course not, it's just, if we can simplify things financially, it makes everything better for everyone. Less stress, more harmony. I nodded slowly, though my thoughts were anything but calm. I'll need to think about it. I know you'll do what's best, she said, rising to her feet. She adjusted her coat collar with a graceful flick of her wrist. Thank you for hearing me out. At the door she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. We all want what's best for Oliver. Remember that. I closed the door behind her, the latch clicking louder than usual. For a long moment I stood there, my hand resting on the cool brass handle. Inside my chest felt tight, my breath shallow. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and sat at the table. My hands were steady on the outside, but inside the ground had shifted. This was no longer about a card or a monthly allowance. It was about control. It was about deciding whether my place in Oliver's life could be dictated by the size of a check I wrote each month. The worst part was the realization that she had said it with such ease, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. I sipped the water, letting the cold slide down my throat, and tried to steady the storm building inside me. I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew one thing: the conversation we had just had would not be the last of its kind, and the next time I would be ready. 2 evenings after Sophie's visit, my phone buzzed with a FaceTime call from Oliver. The sight of his name on the screen made me smile instantly. No matter how heavy my thoughts had been lately, hearing his voice always lifted me. When the video connected, his little face filled the screen. His hair was sticking up at odd angles, and behind him I could see the familiar corner of his bedroom, with the bookshelf I had given him last Christmas. "Hi, Grandma," he said, waving enthusiastically. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, feeling the tension in my shoulders loosen just a little. "How's my favorite astronaut tonight?" He grinned. "I learned more about black holes today. They can suck up everything, even light." We talked about his science class for a few minutes, his voice brimming with excitement as he explained how his teacher had shown them a model of the solar system. I could almost see the light in his eyes through the phone. Then I asked casually, "So when are you coming over to Grandma's house again? We haven't baked cookies in a while." His smile faltered for just a second. He glanced off screen, then back at me. I don't think I can come this week." My heart sank a little. "Oh, why not?" He hesitated, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. "Mom said, well, she said you made her upset, so we're not coming over right now." I felt the air shift around me, that quiet drop in temperature when a truth finally lands. "She said I made her upset," I repeated softly, trying to keep my voice steady for his sake. "Yeah," he replied clearly, unsure if he should say more. "She said maybe later when things are better, but I miss you, Grandma." The words wrapped around my heart like a vice. I wanted to reach through the screen, pull him close, and tell him everything would be fine, but I also knew he was just repeating what he'd been told. I wasn't about to make him feel caught in the middle. "I miss you too, Ollie," I said gently, "and no matter what you know, Grandma loves you to the moon and back." His face brightened a little. "I know." We talked a while longer about his school project, a model of Saturn he was building out of cardboard and paint. He told me about the silver glitter he planned to use for the rings, and I promised to save him some of the star-shaped sprinkles in my kitchen for when we made cookies again. But even as I laughed with him, the weight in my chest wouldn't lift. I could hear Sophie's voice from 2 days ago, smooth and measured, telling me that maybe I wouldn't see Oliver as much if we couldn't simplify our arrangement. Now here was Oliver, unknowingly confirming it. When the call ended, I stared at the darkened screen for a long moment. I thought about all the times he'd run to my door after school, his little backpack bouncing as he hugged me. I thought about how he loved to curl up on the couch with me, reading about planets or tracing constellations in the sky. And I thought about the possibility of losing that, not because of distance or circumstance, but because someone had decided my presence was conditional. I set the phone down and walked into the kitchen. The quiet of the house pressed in on me heavier than usual. I opened the drawer where I kept the credit card statements and looked at them again. The spa visits, the handbags, the dinners, the investment group, and not one trace of Oliver's telescope or new books or science camp fees. It was no longer just about money. Sophie had made it clear that my relationship with Oliver could be used as a bargaining chip. And now, Oliver had shown me, without even meaning to, that the game had already begun. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. If I was going to protect my time with him, my bond with him, I needed to start thinking differently. This wasn't just a disagreement over finances. It was a quiet battle for the heart of my relationship with my grandson, and I wasn't going to lose. A week after my call with Oliver, I decided to do something that I thought might help heal the growing rift. I knew Ethan and Sophie had been talking about taking a family trip, so I called Ethan and offered to pay for it entirely airfare hotel activities. "I just want Oliver to have something special to remember," I told him. "A little adventure before he gets too old for these magical family vacations." Ethan hesitated at first, but then his tone softened. "That's really generous, Mom. I know Oliver would love it. I'll talk to Sophie and get back to you." Within 2 days, the plans were set. They had chosen Florida warm beaches, a resort with a children's program, even a day at one of the big theme parks. I took care of everything, arranging the reservations myself, putting it all on my card. I imagined Oliver's face when he saw the ocean again, the way his hair would blow in the salty breeze. For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful. Maybe this trip could be a bridge instead of another crack. I started quietly preparing for my part in it. I found a straw hat I hadn't worn in years, ordered sunscreen, and even bought a lightweight camera to capture moments with Oliver. I pictured us building sandcastles together, walking along the shoreline, maybe even looking up at the night sky from the beach. The night before I planned to start packing, my phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. It was short. "Mom, about the trip. You're not coming. Sophie wants to make it just her family." I read it twice, my stomach tightening with each word. My fingers hovered over the screen, but I didn't reply right away. I read it again. Her family. I set the phone down and stared at the kitchen wall. The warmth I'd been feeling all week drained away, leaving something cold and still. When I finally picked up the phone again, I typed, "I thought I was part of this family." Then I deleted it. What would be the point? Instead, I called Ethan. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, Mom," he said quickly. His tone clipped, like he wanted to get the conversation over with. "Ethan?" I began slowly. "I don't understand. I paid for this trip. All of it. Why wouldn't I be part of it?" There was a pause on the line. "Mom, Sophie thinks it would be better for the kids if it was just, you know, her side. She says it'll make things less complicated." I closed my eyes. "Less complicated, Ethan. I'm your mother. Oliver is my grandson. I'm not an outsider to be managed." I know he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I just think maybe it's best to keep the peace right now. Keep the peace." The phrase felt bitter in my mouth. Keeping the peace had become the excuse for every concession I'd made, every silent retreat I'd taken. I didn't argue further. I could tell his mind was already made up, or worse, that the decision had never been his to make in the first place. After we hung up, I sat at the table in the quiet house, the glow from the phone still lighting up the dark wood. I thought about Oliver on the beach, laughing in the surf, and me nowhere near to see it. I thought about Sophie's carefully chosen words from our last conversation, her suggestion that I might see less of Oliver if I didn't cooperate. And now, here, it was not as a vague warning, but as a reality. I stood and walked to the hallway closet. The straw hat sat on the shelf, the sunscreen still in its shopping bag beneath it. I reached for both, then set them back down. My fingers lingered on the brim of the hat before I let it go. That night, I lay awake for hours, the sound of the clock ticking in the living room like a steady reminder that time was slipping by. Each tick felt like another mile added to the distance between me and my grandson. In the morning, I didn't call Ethan. I didn't call Sophie. I simply went into the kitchen, brewed my coffee, and stared out the window at the empty street. I told myself I had done something kind, something meant to bring us closer. Instead, it had been used to draw another line, one that left me firmly on the outside. And though I didn't know it yet, this moment would be the turning point. Because once you've been pushed out of a circle you thought you belonged to, you stop trying to prove you deserve to be there. The morning after Ethan's call, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stood in the kitchen, holding my coffee, staring at the steam curling into the air. It was a stillness I had come to recognize, not just the absence of noise, but the kind that comes before you make a decision you can't take back. For weeks, I had tried to reason with myself. I had tried to see Sophie's actions as misunderstandings, her words as poorly chosen. I had told myself I could swallow the insults, accept the sidelines if it meant keeping a place in Oliver's life. But the trip had been the final push. I had paid for a vacation I wasn't welcome to attend. And no one, not even Ethan, had defended my place. I walked into my study and sat down at the desk where I kept my personal files. The top drawer slid open, easily revealing my folder of financial documents. The credit card agreement was right on top, along with a small notepad where I had been tracking the charges. I flipped through the last two statements again. Spa days, designer handbags, the same overpriced restaurant, and of course, the investment group charges. My thumb rested on the line with the most recent amount, $4,200 this time. I picked up the phone and dialed the customer service number printed on the back of the card. A polite voice answered, asking how she could help me today. "I'd like to remove an authorized user from my account." I said, my tone even. She confirmed my information, then asked for the name of the user. Sophie Whitmore. I said, my voice catching just slightly on the last name. There was a brief pause as the representative typed. "All right, Mrs. Whitmore. I can remove her immediately. Would you like me to send written confirmation?" "Yes," I replied. "Please." With a few clicks, it was done. Years of quiet generosity of covering expenses I never agreed to, of being treated like an invisible benefactor, ended in less than 5 minutes. I thanked her and hung up. The room felt strangely lighter, but not in a triumphant way. More like when you set down a heavy bag you've been carrying for too long, your arms are free, but they still ache. I sat there for a moment, letting the reality settle in. I hadn't told Ethan. I hadn't warned Sophie, and I didn't plan to. This wasn't a declaration. It was a quiet reclamation of my own boundaries. That evening, there was a family dinner at a midtown restaurant. I went wearing my favorite navy dress and a simple silver necklace. I greeted everyone warmly, even Sophie, who smiled in that perfectly measured way she does. The meal passed pleasantly enough. Stories were shared. Wine was poured. Oliver laughed at the silly faces I made from across the table. When the bill came, the waiter laid it discreetly beside me. Without hesitation, I placed my card on top. "I've got this one," I said with a smile. Ethan gave me a grateful nod. Sophie murmured, "That's so generous of you." I signed the receipt, handed it back, and finished my coffee. As we all stood to leave, I kissed Oliver's head, promising to see him soon. What they didn't know, what I kept entirely to myself, was that by the next morning, Sophie would try to use that card and be met with a declined transaction. There would be no scene, no confrontation in the parking lot, no raised voices, just a quiet, invisible line drawn firmly in the sand. On the drive home, the city lights blurred outside my window. I thought about the look on Sophie's face when she discovered the change. I didn't imagine anger so much as confusion, because in her mind the arrangement had always been permanent. But nothing is permanent, not when it chips away at your dignity. And as much as I loved Oliver, I couldn't teach him that it was acceptable to give and give until there was nothing left of you. I pulled into my driveway, shut off the engine, and sat in the dark for a while. The silence felt different this time. Not heavy, not waiting, but chosen. I knew the fallout would come in one form or another, but for the first time in a long while, I felt steady. My plan had begun not with an argument, but with a single quiet act that said enough. It didn't take long. The morning after I removed Sophie from my credit card, my phone rang just as I was buttering a piece of toast. Her name lit up the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Diane," she said without preamble, her voice tight. "There's a problem with the card." I took a slow sip of my coffee before replying. "Oh yes," she said sharply. "It was declined last night. I had to cover the bill myself, which was inconvenient." The pause before that last word was pointed as though she wanted me to feel guilty. I set my toast down. "That's because you're no longer an authorized user." My tone was calm, even like I was explaining the weather. Silence crackled through the line for a heartbeat before she spoke again. "Why would you do that without telling me I didn't think it was necessary?" I said. The arrangement wasn't working. It was working for Oliver, she shot back. "Was it?" I asked quietly. "Because I looked at the statement, Sophie, and I didn't see a single thing for him, not one." Her inhale was sharp, but she recovered quickly. "You don't understand the bigger picture. You've put me in a very difficult position." I could have said 100 things in that moment, but instead I chose the simplest truth. "I think you'll manage." And then before she could say more, I ended the call. An hour later, Ethan called. "Mom, what's going on?" His voice was tense, carrying the weariness of a man caught between two worlds. I ended the card arrangement, I said plainly. It wasn't being used for what we agreed on. He sighed heavily. "Sophie says you embarrassed her. She had to pay for dinner last night in front of friends. Do you know how that looks?" I leaned against the counter. "Ethan, I've been covering expenses I never agreed to for months, and apparently I was also funding her investment ventures. If anyone should be embarrassed, it isn't me. She says you're overreacting," he replied. "And she says I won't see Oliver if I don't comply. Does that sound reasonable to you?" There was a pause. She didn't mean it like that. Then how did she mean it? My voice was still calm, but my hands had curled into fists at my sides. Another pause. "I just think you could have handled it differently." "I've been handling it quietly for a long time," I said, "and quiet doesn't seem to change anything." He didn't have an answer for that. We ended the call shortly after both of us saying we'd talk later, though I knew it would be a while before that talk came. That night, as I was rinsing dishes, my phone buzzed with a FaceTime request. Oliver. When I answered, his face filled the screen, eyes bright under the warm glow of his bedroom lamp. "Hi, Grandma." "Hi, sweetheart," I said, instantly smiling despite the day I'd had. "How's my favorite stargazer?" He giggled. "Good. I wanted to show you something." He held up a cardboard model of Saturn painted carefully with golden rings. "It's beautiful, Ollie," I said. "You worked hard on that." "I wanted you to see it before I take it to school," he said proudly. "We talked about his project, his science class, and the book he was reading. He didn't mention anything about the tension between the adults, and I didn't bring it up." But before we hung up, he lowered his voice. "Grandma, are you mad at Mom?" I swallowed. "No, sweetheart. I'm not mad at you or your mom. Sometimes grown-ups just see things differently." He nodded slowly as if filing that away for later. "Okay, I just don't want you to stop coming around." My heart ached at the sincerity in his voice. "I'll always be here for you, Ollie. Always." After we said goodbye, I sat on the couch in the dim light of the living room. Sophie was angry, Ethan was caught in the middle, and Oliver sweet innocent. Oliver was already feeling the ripples of a storm he didn't start. The reaction I'd set in motion was messy, inevitable, and exactly what I had expected. But I also knew the line had been drawn, and I wasn't going back. It was Michael who brought me the truth. 3 days after the fallout with Sophie and Ethan, I heard a knock at my front door. When I opened it, Michael was standing there with a manila envelope in his hand. His expression was serious, the kind he wore when he was about to deliver news he knew I wouldn't like. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. We sat at my kitchen table, the afternoon light slanting across the wood. He slid the envelope toward me. "I didn't want to get involved," he said, "but I think you should see this." I opened it slowly, my fingers brushing against a stack of printed pages, financial statements, court documents, and what looked like emails. I scanned the first page and my heart began to pound. It was a debt collection notice addressed to Sophie. The amount due was staggering tens of thousands of dollars. The next document showed a list of failed investments, boutique retail ventures, high-risk real estate, and something called Aurora Capital Growth Fund. Every one of them had loss stamped next to it in bold red letters. I flipped to another page. This one showed wire transfers, large ones, from Sophie's personal account to these ventures, and then smaller, but just as telling charges from my credit card that matched the same dates and nearly the same amounts. "She's been using your resources to prop up her investments," Michael said quietly, "and from the looks of it, she's been in trouble for a while." I leaned back in my chair, the papers still in my hand. Suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place. The expensive dinners, the designer bags, the investment group charges. She hadn't been living extravagantly just for pleasure. She had been scrambling to maintain the illusion of success, while her finances crumbled behind the scenes. "Ethan doesn't know," Michael added. I asked around. "She's kept it from him. My guess is she's terrified he'll find out." I stared at the documents, feeling a mixture of anger, pity, and something harder to define. She had manipulated me, yes. She had tried to control my relationship with my grandson, but now I could see the fear underneath her polish. She was a woman in deep financial trouble, building her stability on someone else's foundation mine because hers had already collapsed. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because I've seen this kind of thing before," Michael said. "And if you know what's really going on, you can decide how to respond. But don't fool yourself. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about survival, hers." I set the papers down. My first instinct was to call Ethan to tell him everything, to let the truth finally shatter whatever false image Sophie had built. But then I thought of Oliver. I thought of how divorce, betrayal, and bitterness could reshape a child's world overnight. I took a long breath. "No," I said finally. "I'm not telling him." Michael studied me. "Are you sure this is leverage? You could use it." I'm sure I said, my voice steady. "I'm not interested in leverage. I just want my boundaries respected. I want my life back, and I want Oliver to have his." Michael nodded slowly as though he understood exactly what I meant. He gathered the papers back into the envelope, but left them on the table in case I changed my mind. After he left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the sunlight shifting across the wood grain. Sophie had wronged me. She had underestimated me, but she was also a person standing on the edge of her own ruin, grasping for anything to keep from falling. I wasn't going to be her safety net anymore. but I also wasn't going to be the one to cut the last rope. It was a strange kind of peace, choosing to walk away without striking the final blow. The truth was in my hands, and I decided to set it down, because some victories aren't about winning a fight. They're about knowing you could have destroyed someone and choosing not to. And in that choice, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: control. A week after Michael handed me the envelope, I was standing in the hallway of Oliver's school waiting for the science fair presentations to begin. The chatter of parents, the shuffle of poster boards, and the smell of construction paper glue filled the air. I hadn't been sure Sophie would be here, but I decided it didn't matter. I was here for one reason: only Oliver. When the classroom door opened, a stream of children filed in, each carrying their projects. And then I saw him, my grandson. His face lit up the moment our eyes met, and without hesitation, he hurried over, clutching a carefully crafted display board. "Grandma, you came." His voice was breathless with excitement. "Of course I did," I said, kneeling so I could look him in the eye. I wouldn't miss this for the world. He grinned and pulled me toward his table. On it sat his model of Saturn, the one he'd shown me over FaceTime weeks before. But now it was finished, painted in deep gold and silver, with delicate glitter rings, circling the planet. "It's perfect, Ollie," I said, genuinely awed. "Tell me all about it." He launched into his explanation with the enthusiasm only a 7-year-old can muster. He talked about how Saturn's rings are made mostly of ice and rock, about its place in the solar system, about how it's big enough to fit hundreds of Earths inside. He pointed out the little moons he had glued around it, each one labeled in tiny, careful handwriting. As he spoke, I found myself studying him, not just his words, but the way his eyes shone, the way his small hands moved with confidence as he described something he loved. In that moment, all the noise of the room faded. When he finished, I said softly, "You know, Ollie, you're pretty amazing." He smiled shyly. "Thanks, Grandma." Then his voice lowered a little, almost like he wasn't sure if he should say the next part. "I'm glad you're here. I wasn't sure if Mom would let you come." I reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind his ear. "I will always find a way to be where you need me to be," I told him, "no matter what." He looked at me for a moment, then leaned in and wrapped his arms around my neck. I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against my shoulder. "You're my favorite person in the whole universe," he whispered. I held him close, my eyes stinging. "And you, my sweet boy, are mine." The teacher's voice called for the presentations to begin, and Oliver pulled back, ready to share his work with the class. I stepped aside, watching him take the front of the room. His voice was clear, his smile steady. I thought about all the challenges and games Sophie had been playing with my place in his life, and how little power they truly had in moments like this. Because here was the truth. Love, real love, isn't something you can gatekeep with rules or conditions. It's in the small, constant acts of showing up. It's in a promise kept over and over again. When his turn ended, I clapped the loudest. He caught my eye and gave me a small, proud nod. It was the kind of nod that said, "I see you. I know you're here for me." Afterward, as the crowd began to thin, Oliver ran back to me. "Grandma, can we go get ice cream? Just us." I glanced toward the hallway, half expecting Sophie to appear and stop us. But she didn't. Maybe she hadn't even noticed me slip in. Or maybe for once she had decided not to interfere. "Absolutely," I said. We walked out together, his small hand tucked in mine. The late afternoon sun painted everything in warm gold, and for the first time in months, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. Whatever came next, whatever games Sophie might still try to play, I knew this bond with Oliver was unshakable, because I had earned it not with money or convenience, but with presence, patience, and the kind of love that never asks for anything in return. And as we headed toward the ice cream shop, I thought to myself, this is what winning looks like. It was a gray Sunday afternoon when I found myself in the kitchen frosting a simple chocolate cake. Nothing fancy, just something I knew Oliver would love. His birthday was still a few weeks away, but I had decided to invite him and Ethan over for an early celebration, just the three of us. I hadn't bothered to check with Sophie. If she wanted to make a scene about a grandmother baking for her grandson, that was on her. When Ethan and Oliver arrived, the house felt alive again. Oliver bounded through the doorway carrying a small paper bag. "Grandma, I made you something." Inside was a little clay planet painted blue and green with tiny white clouds. "It's Earth," he explained proudly, "so you'll always have a whole world from me." I laughed softly and hugged him. "It's perfect, Ollie. I'll keep it where I can see it every day." We had lunch, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, his favorite, and then I brought out the cake. Oliver's eyes went wide when I set it on the table. "Can I blow out the candles now?" "Of course," I said, lighting 3 small candles in the center. He closed his eyes, whispered something I couldn't hear, and blew them out in one go. It struck me then last year at his birthday party, he'd been told to blow out candles on a cake that wasn't mine, while the one I had made for him sat in the corner, untouched. This time he was blowing them out on my cake first. After cake, Oliver went to the living room to play with his building blocks, leaving me and Ethan alone at the table. He looked at me with a mix of weariness and gratitude. "Mom," he said quietly, "thank you for doing this. I know things have been tense." I nodded. "Ethan, I'm not trying to make things harder for you. But I need you to understand I won't let anyone decide my place in Oliver's life based on what I give financially. I love him. That's the only currency that matters to me." He looked down at his hands. "I know, and I'm sorry. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was enough. I didn't need him to choose sides. I just needed him to see that my boundaries were not an attack, they were protection." Later, when it was time for them to leave, Oliver hugged me tightly. "Don't forget," he said, "you promised we'd finish building the Lego rocket next weekend." "I wouldn't miss it," I told him. After they drove away, I stood at the window watching until the car turned the corner. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same heavy quiet from before. This one felt earned, chosen. I thought back to the envelope Michael had given me, to the temptation I'd felt to expose Sophie's secrets. How easy it would have been to tear everything open to watch the pieces fall where they may, but I hadn't. Not because she deserved my silence, but because Oliver deserved my restraint. That was the difference. Walking into the living room, I set Oliver's clay earth on the mantel right beside the framed photo of him and me at the park last fall. The little planet seemed to wink at me in the afternoon light. I realized then that my victory wasn't in forcing anyone to admit they'd been wrong. It wasn't in cutting ties or proving a point. My victory was in holding on to myself, in refusing to become bitter, in refusing to let someone else's choices dictate my worth. Because I had learned something in these past months, generosity without boundaries invites exploitation. But love with boundaries invites respect. And if respect doesn't come, at least you've protected the part of yourself that can still give without resentment. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, the steam rising into the fading light. Somewhere out there, Sophie would be recalculating her plans without my credit card at her disposal. I didn't need to know the details. What I did know was that I had drawn my line and I had done it without cruelty. My grandson still knew me as his constant, his safe place. And that was enough. You can't control how others treat you, but you can control the moment you stop allowing them to take more than they give. And in that choice, in that quiet, resolute choice, you find peace.